You think you've hidden the cost of your excesses? You think the scales are balanced because you say they are? You are wrong. There is a geometry to this universe that requires an exact payment for every grain of pride you've stolen from the light. She is not a deity of vengeance. She is the gravity of morality, the inevitable correction for a life that dared to be more than it was allotted. You aren't just listening to a story. You are sitting on the scale, and it is already tipping. Welcome back. We are going into the oldest wound in the sky now. That is, I want to say that differently. We are not going toward it. We are already inside it. We have been inside it. She was sent down. Wings, dark ones. And I want to be careful here because the word dark has been cheapened, overused, applied to everything vaguely ominous until it means almost nothing. And what I am trying to describe is something that predates the word itself. Not the darkness of a moonless night, or a villain's coat, or ink, or sorrow, but a darkness that is structural, constitutional, the wings of a principle that existed before principles had names. She moved without hurry. She never needed to hurry. The one she was coming for was already hers, had always been hers. From the moment the scale tipped, from the moment some mortal or god or king stretched out their hands and took more than the world had allocated them. More happiness, more pride, more power or beauty or luck than any single being is designed to carry. The moment that happened, she had already begun moving toward them. Slow, inevitable, the way a tide moves, the way dark moves in from the horizon when the sun goes down. You do not see it approaching. You only notice eventually that the light you were standing in is simply gone. Her name was Nemesis. And before you decide you already know what that word means, before you reach for the version of it that language handed you, the compressed version, the shorthand, pause. Please, sit here for a moment. Here is what most people believe, that Nemesis was revenge, a goddess of punishment, that she existed to hurt the proud, to shorten the tall ones, to ensure the wicked suffered for their specific sins. Anger wearing a face, something dark and punitive, a cosmic enforcer, suffering dressed in black and carrying a whip. They are wrong. I want to say that plainly. Before the version of Nemesis that became a word in your language, before she was compressed into a synonym for enemy, for downfall, for the one who ultimately brings you low, there was something else, something older and stranger and far more difficult to hold in the mind. Before she was reduced to a concept, she was a goddess, a real one of the oldest ones, and she did not simply punish. She balanced. She did not simply take. She returned. She was not anger. She was something colder than anger, something so ancient it has no clean equivalent in any modern language, because modern languages were not built with enough room for it. She was the reckoning at the center of everything that exists. The story of what she truly was, what she truly did, what it cost the world and what it cost her, and what it cost the ones who looked at her face for too long. That story has been sleeping for 2,000 years. We are going into it now. We are going into the oldest reckoning. Before Nemesis, there was the problem of too much. This is not a complicated idea, but it is a large one. The problem of too much. Before cities, before law, before the whole elaborate architecture of human civilization was assembled, stone by stone and century by century. The world cohered around a principle so simple it was almost invisible: balance, proportion, the understanding that the universe is not a place of unlimited abundance for any single being. The sea gives fish, but it does not give you all the fish. The sun shines, but it does not shine exclusively on you. Good fortune, beauty, power, health, luck, these are not personal possessions. They are loans. You are given your portion. What the world has decided belongs to you. And as long as you hold only that, everything holds. The great invisible scales of existence stay level. The world breathes in, breathes out. But when someone reaches for more, when a king decides he wants the portion of two kings, when a hero decides his glory should be permanent, when a god reaches for what was not given, the scales tip. And when they tip, something wakes. The Greeks called this principle Nemesis, from the word nemein, to give what is due, to distribute, to assign. Before it was a name, it was a verb, an action, the act of righteous distribution. The goddess who embodied it was born from necessity, the way gravity was discovered rather than invented, the way night is not created, but is what happens when the sun moves away from a given patch of sky. She was born from night, Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, one of the first things that existed, one of the forces that even Zeus, and this detail matters, this is worth holding on to, even Zeus feared. From that deep, original dark, Nemesis emerged, not from light, not from order, not from Olympus and its arrangements and its hierarchies, from the oldest dark, the dark that existed before the gods built their houses on the mountain and declared themselves rulers of what they found there, the dark that remembered the time before all of that. And that is the first thing you need to understand about her. She did not answer to them. She came from somewhere they could not reach, a place below the architecture of their world, where fundamental laws breathed without any name attached to them. Here is where the story becomes strange. Nemesis, the actual goddess, the real one, not the concept, not the vocabulary word. She did not want this. She did not choose her function the way a craftsman chooses a trade or a soldier chooses a side. She did not descend to the world with eagerness, with purpose burning in her chest, ready to balance scales and correct the proud. She was not Ares, who loved war the way something that has never known anything other than war loves the only thing it knows. She was not Aphrodite, who wore her nature like a second skin. Nemesis was a goddess who felt the weight of what she carried, who understood with total clarity what it meant to be the instrument of inevitability, who knew that the ones she was moving toward, even the genuinely guilty ones, even the ones who had truly accumulated more than their portion, were still real, were still breathing, were still full of everything that makes a living thing complicated and luminous and not quite reducible to their worst choice. She understood this, and she came anyway. I find this the hardest part to describe, actually, the willingness inside the inevitability. I keep circling it. I am not sure I have the right words for it yet. The fear at the center of every figure who would become her subject. And there are many, because the story of Nemesis is not one story. It is a recurring structure, a shape that keeps appearing across the ancient world wearing different faces and different crowns. The fear is always the same. Not fear of pain, fear of being seen, of being measured, of standing in front of something vast and impartial and being weighed not by an enemy who hates you, not by a rival who covets what you have, but by the architecture of the universe itself, by the principle of proportion, by the deep law that simply says you have taken more than your share. Now it returns. The law that governs everything that follows is this: nothing is ever truly lost. What is taken in excess is never kept. It flows back, always. Not because someone planned it, not because a god made a decision in a council chamber and signed a decree. The world is structured this way, the way water seeks its level, the way fire consumes what feeds it and then goes dark. Excess is a temporary distortion. Nemesis is what happens when the distortion corrects. She is not the punishment. She is the return. Let me collect the thread here. There is a lot of it. You are standing in a marketplace, stone underfoot, worn smooth by decades of feet. I almost said thousands, but let's say decades. Let's stay with something we can feel. The smell of dried herbs and fresh fish, and the particular sharp sweetness of wine cut with water, the way the Greeks drank it. They believed that drinking wine undiluted was a kind of madness, a kind of reaching. Everything in proportion. Even pleasure, especially pleasure. Across the square there is a man. He is a king. You can tell before anyone tells you. Something in how the crowd adjusts around him. Not quickly enough to look afraid, but slowly enough to reveal that they have learned. He is handsome in the way power makes men handsome. He has been lucky, exceptionally, structurally lucky. Lucky in ways that, had you been counting, and she was always counting, would have made you uneasy years ago. His name does not matter yet. What matters is the quality of the luck, the precise, accumulated, impossible weight of it. Because luck was never meant to pool in one man. Luck is meant to move through the world the way water moves through soil, seeping into everything it touches, sustaining the whole, not collecting in one depression until the ground there is saturated and everything around it has dried out. But his luck had been pooling for decades. His crops didn't fail when other men's failed. His ships came home when other ships sank. His children were born healthy when other children weren't. His walls held. His enemies died before they could properly threaten him. His treasury grew, and he stood in that marketplace with the absolute, unexamined confidence of a man who had never once been pressed against the question of why. And she was watching him, not from a cloud, not from a mountain, from somewhere older than both, from the same deep, inarticulate dark where night breathes in her slow, constitutional way. She was watching and she was noting. No emotion in it, no hurry, no satisfaction. The precise weight of what he had accumulated, and the precise weight of what had been drained from elsewhere so that he could hold it. Because this is the thing about one man's excess that the man in the marketplace never considers. It does not materialize from nothing. When one man's scales are heavy on the side of fortune, there is another set of scales somewhere on which the weight is missing. The good is not infinite. When it pools, it drains from somewhere else. It cannot do otherwise. She noted the farmer 3 days' walk east, whose crops had failed a third year. The rains that would have saved him had gone to this king's fields, not by anyone's decision, not by design or malice, but by the strange hydraulics of divine distribution, the way fortune gravitates toward the cup that is already full. She noted the sailor whose ship went down in a storm, that this king's admiral had passed through without a scratch, as if the sea had made a quiet, unremarked choice. She noted the children, the ones outside these walls, in the villages, who were not born healthy. She was keeping the ledger that no one else was keeping. That is, I think, what frightens me most about her. Not the wings, the ledger. Anyway, before she had a name, before she became a goddess with attributes and stories and a role in the mythological architecture, she was just this, a function, an operation that the world performed on itself, the automatic correction, like the way your body runs a fever when something foreign enters it. There is no decision made, no committee convened, no punishment handed down. Just the system doing what the system does to return to what it is supposed to be. And then humans, because humans cannot let a force remain nameless, because naming things is how we tolerate their existence, gave her a face, wings, a wheel sometimes, a whip. They gave her a chariot drawn by griffins. They built her temples. The most famous one was at Rhamnus in Attica. And I keep meaning to, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the temples existed, that people went and stood in them and felt, presumably, something. Some recognition of what she was, what she did. The wheel is the image I keep returning to. I'm not entirely sure why I find it more disturbing than the wings. Maybe because wings imply a being with direction, with intention, going somewhere. The wheel just turns. It has always been turning. It will turn regardless. There is no appeal to a wheel. She carried scales in some depictions. The scales make sense. The wheel makes sense. The whip is the depiction that feels like a human addition. The part where we couldn't quite hold the concept at its most abstract and had to make it physical, make it something that could hurt us in a way we understand. We do this constantly. We take vast, impersonal forces and dress them in things that hit us, as if being struck by a whip is actually worse than being corrected by the deep structure of the universe. It isn't. Not even close. The scale tipped for this king eventually. They always did. The specific mechanism of the tipping is almost beside the point. Almost, though it is never quite. Sometimes it was a single act of extraordinary overreach. Sometimes it was the cumulative weight of decades of quiet accumulation, a life built so carefully on more than one's portion that the architecture eventually became impossible to sustain. Sometimes Nemesis came fast. Sometimes she came so slowly that the man she came for had died of old age, and she settled the account with his house, his children, his memory. She was not cruel. This is important. She was patient, which is a different thing and easy to confuse with cruelty when you are the one waiting for the bill. The king in the marketplace, his luck ran out. I'm going to say that plainly and without ornamentation, because the ornamentation would make it feel more dramatic than it actually was. It was quiet. The way the scale's correcting is almost always quiet. A door closes. A ship doesn't come back. A child is born and doesn't survive the first winter. The excess drains. The ground levels. What had pooled disperses. And somewhere, 3 days' walk east, a farmer's crop comes in. Nothing is ever truly lost. It returns. She was watching. She is always watching. Slow, impartial, the oldest ledger keeper, born from a dark deeper than any darkness the Olympians ever touched. The wheel turns. It has always been turning. And here is the thing about that ledger, the thing that makes it stranger and more terrible than simple punishment. She kept it without judgment. She was not angry at the king. She did not wish him ill in the personal, human way. That hot, specific chest feeling that says, you should not have done that, and now I want you to hurt the way I hurt. She felt none of that. She felt something colder, something more absolute, something closer to what a river feels when it reaches a dam. Pressure, the physical fact of accumulation, the physical fact that water blocked in one direction will find another. That pressure builds, that what cannot move will eventually move the thing, stopping it or destroy it, or both. This is what it felt like to be in her sight, being measured, which is so much harder to survive than being hated. And I want to sit with that distinction for a moment because I think most people skip past it. Now, let us move through the mythology the way it actually lived. Not as a single story, but as a constellation, a set of encounters, each one catching a different angle of the same ancient light. She did not appear once. She appeared again and again across the long life of the Greek world, wearing different faces, coming for different people, each of them guilty of a slightly different shape of excess. And each time, the ending was the same. Not because she forced it, because the world, distorted long enough, will always return to its shape. Narcissus, you know the surface of this one. Everyone does. The beautiful boy, the pool, the reflection, the wasting. You have heard it explained as a warning about vanity, about self-love, about the danger of being too impressed with yourself. That is not quite what it was. Narcissus was, I want to be careful here because the usual framing keeps pulling at me, and I don't think the usual framing is precise enough. He was punished, or rather Nemesis was sent, for something specific, something exact, the refusal of love that comes towards you, the hoarding of the thing that love actually is, which is a movement, a direction, an outward reach, a giving of oneself across the distance between one being and another. He had been given extraordinary beauty, a portion of loveliness so far beyond the ordinary allotment that it was almost a kind of overreach in itself, though beauty given is not the crime. The crime, if we must call it that, was in what he did with it. Instead of letting it move outward, flow outward, connect him to the world and the people reaching toward him from it, he turned it inward, closed the circuit, directed the love that should have moved between himself and the world back toward himself alone. A system with no exit, and a closed loop held at full pressure long enough will always break. Echo had loved him. Echo, the nymph who could only repeat, who had been stripped of her own voice by Hera for using it as cover while Zeus conducted himself badly on the slopes below, punished for being a distraction, punished for the crime of someone else's appetite, which is a particular kind of injustice that the myths record without quite naming. She could not speak first, could not reach, could only reflect back what was already given to her, which meant the only conversation she could ever have was one that someone else had started, and she had to wait, always wait, for a word she could catch and return. When she saw Narcissus and loved him, with the full, helpless force of a being who has no other way to be. She followed him through the forests, waiting for an opening, waiting for him to give her something she could shape into contact. He turned away, not with cruelty, without cruelty, which is almost worse. He simply turned, the way a man walking in a direction doesn't look at the paths that don't go where he's going. His heart was completely full of his own face. There was no room left in it for anything outside itself. Echo faded. This is a very old kind of dying. Not dramatic, not fast. A daily diminishment. Her body dissolving into rocks and air until only the voice remained. Only the reflection function. The eternal hollow repetition of conversations that were never quite conversations, because she could only ever come second, only ever answer, only ever return. She returned still, in empty buildings, in gorges, and the particular loneliness of a sound that comes back to you changed. Let me collect the thread here. I keep moving toward the Narcissus story faster than I should, because it is the one I find most, I'm not sure exactly why I find it, the most unsettling of her myths. Maybe because the mechanism is so precise. Maybe because it requires no violence. Nemesis had been watching from the first refusal, watching the love that came toward him and found no opening. She arranged, not forced, arranged. There is a difference. She arranged the world so that on a particular afternoon, at the particular exhaustion of a successful hunt, he would bend to drink from a pool in a forest clearing, and he would see his face. For the first time in the way, she needed him to see it, not in a mirror that could be set down, not in the eyes of an admirer who could be dismissed, in water, in the water's faithful, unmoving, perfect reflection, and he would love it. Of course, he would love it. He had been practicing loving it his whole life. She simply gave him a version that could not love him back. This is the elegance of what she does. She returns. Narcissus had spent his whole life directing love inward, giving nothing outward, turning away from everyone who reached toward him. She gave him the experience he had given Echo, exactly. A love that mirrors everything, but never reaches, never closes the distance, never touches. The account paid in the exact currency of the debt. He stayed at that pool. The hunger came, the cold. The light changed and he followed the reflection as it shifted across the water's surface, shaking with a love that had nowhere to go, that could only circle back, that was consuming him from the inside, the way a fire consumes what feeds it. And at the end, when the body could no longer hold the tension of it, he dissolved into the earth, into the flower that bears his name, which is beautiful and still and fixed and never ever moves toward anything. The scales returned to level. She felt, I keep trying to describe what she felt, and I keep getting it wrong, or getting it slightly wrong, or landing just beside the right word. It was not satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling of an exhale, the release of a pressure that has finally been relieved, the world breathing out. She turned and looked for the next one. There was always a next one. This quality of endless continuation is the most unsettling thing about her. She could not finish because the desire for more is as old as consciousness itself, as old as the first moment a living thing looked at its portion and decided it was insufficient. As long as that desire existed, and it always would, she would be moving, measuring, returning. She was a pattern, a rhythm beneath everything. Anyway, creases, king of Lydia, the richest man in the ancient world. And I mean that in the way the ancient world meant it, which is categorically, absolutely, as a statement of recorded fact rather than approximation. When the Greeks needed to express wealth so extreme it distorted the surrounding reality, they said rich as Croesus, and they kept saying it for 25 centuries, which means the name became a unit of measurement, became the word for a concept rather than the person who embodied it. He was real. He was historical. He ruled in the 6th century before the Common Era, in what is now Western Turkey, in a kingdom watered by the Pactolus River, the river where Midas, according to the myth, had washed away his golden touch and turned the water and the sand gold-bearing forever after. Croesus ruled a land that produced gold from the ground, from the rivers, from the rocks. He did not build his wealth. He breathed it. He lived inside it the way you live inside a climate. He was not cruel. He built temples. He gave to the oracle at Delphi on a scale that defied ordinary generosity. A golden lion resting on a base of gold bricks, a silver mixing bowl that held 10,000 gallons, offerings so extravagant and so beautiful that the Greeks described them for generations after the man himself was gone. These were, I kept wanting to call them bribes, but that is the wrong word. That is the lazy reading. They were love offerings. The love of a man who had accumulated so much that giving felt like the only moral response to having, the only way to make the weight of it bearable, to return some of it upward towards something larger. He was not a bad man. He was a man who was too certain. And certainty, unexamined, absolute certainty, is a form of excess. I want to say that again, because it is the move that the Croesus story makes that is easy to miss. It is not the wealth that brings Nemesis. It is the certainty underneath the wealth, the conviction that his fortune was permanent, that the scales were not being watched, that no one was measuring the distance between what he held and what had been assigned to him. He had been blessed, he thought. Not loaned to, blessed. And he treated the blessing as though it had no return address. He went to Delphi, wanted to know if he should attack Persia. The oracle gave him the answer she was famous for, the kind that works in both directions simultaneously. Cross the Halys River, and a great empire falls. He heard what he wanted to hear. He armed his soldiers. He crossed. The empire that fell was his. Cyrus of Persia destroyed him, his kingdom taken, his treasury, the wonder of the ancient world, the thing that made his name a word, stripped, his city fallen, and Croesus himself was captured and sentenced to be burned alive, which is how the Persians erased a king, publicly, irreversibly, in fire. And here is where the story breaks open into something that feels almost, I almost wrote something that would have yanked us entirely out of the ancient world. Some comparison that doesn't belong here. Never mind. What it breaks open into is something strange and beautiful and entirely Nemesian. The fire was lit. He was on the pyre. And in that moment, standing in the heat of everything he had lost, the gold, the certainty, the absolute unearned conviction that the world had simply decided to favor him, he called out a name. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, the man who had visited him years before and to whom Croesus had shown his treasury, his wealth, everything that his life had accumulated. in the way that a man who has too much will sometimes need to show it to a witness, will need someone with eyes to confirm the reality of it. And Solon had refused to say what Croesus wanted him to say, had refused to name him the happiest of men, which was what Croesus needed to hear, which was the confirmation he had been building toward his entire life. Solon had said instead, "Call no man happy until he is dead," had said, "The god overturns things." Croesus had dismissed this, filed it under the category of philosopher talk, the abstract moralizing of a man who did not have enough to understand what having felt like. On the pyre, he called the name, and Cyrus, who was watching, who was curious about what a man says in that moment, paused, asked what it meant, heard the story, and was, by the story, persuaded to stop the burning, to pull Croesus from the fire, to make him eventually an advisor. She returned the thing he had. She returned his certainty to him as its opposite. She handed him, at the end, exactly the wisdom he had dismissed at the beginning, not as punishment, as return, the scales, level. She moved on. The wheel turned. It was always turning. The ledger kept itself. On the pyre, with the flames already climbing, Croesus called out a name, Solon. He called out the name of Solon, a Greek philosopher who had visited him years earlier at the absolute height of his fortune, when the gold was still real and the certainty was still intact, and who had said something that Croesus had not been equipped to understand. Solon had said, "Count no man happy until he is dead, until the story is finished, until the ending has arrived and all the evidence is in." Because happiness is an assessment, and you cannot make the assessment until the thing you're assessing has completed itself. Croesus had been offended. Of course he had been offended. He had shown Solon everything, the treasury, the armies, the temples, the gold stacked in its chambers, the whole overwhelming accumulated architecture of his fortune. And Solon had looked at it and said, "I will not call you happy yet. I will wait." And now, on the pyre, fire climbing, the entire world of his certainty reduced to ash around him. He understood what Solon had meant. He called the name, and Cyrus, the Persian, who was listening, who was watching the way conquerors watch the men they have conquered, with that complicated mixture of victory and something else, something harder to name, heard the cry and asked what it meant, was told the story of Solon, understood something in the deep, cold way that a genuinely intelligent person understands something about themselves when a mirror is placed in front of them at exactly the right angle. And he ordered the fire put out, the scales, level. Croesus lived. He was returned, not destroyed, not broken entirely, but returned to a proportion that fit him. He would advise Cyrus. He would be the wise man who had learned from inside the lesson, which is the only place the lesson is actually learned. He was genuinely humble afterward, by all accounts. The ancient sources say this, and I believe them, because this is how it works. You cannot perform your way to that kind of humility. You can only arrive at it by having stood on the pyre. She does not hate, she teaches. Her classroom has no windows, and the lesson costs everything. There is a third story. I need you to stay with me for this one, because it is the oldest of the three, and it is the one that changes the shape of everything that came before it. This one reaches back to before the Olympians had fully settled into their roles, back when the hierarchy of the divine was still fluid is the right word, I think. Still fluid, still subject to renegotiation and force, and the outcomes of contests that hadn't been run yet. This one involves Zeus. And this is the one that makes clear that Nemesis is woven into the structure of divine existence itself. That even the king of the gods could not step outside the principle she embodied without the principle responding. Zeus desired her, the actual goddess. He looked at Nemesis, at the being who carried the scales, who kept the ledger, who was the living embodiment of proportion, and wanted her. The way gods want things, which I find very difficult to describe without importing a framework that doesn't belong here, a framework about consent and power, and what the word no means when it is said to someone who has never genuinely been refused. He had taken what he wanted across the entire span of creation. He had learned in the deepest structure of his understanding that wanting and having were more or less the same operation, just wanting, and then the interval, and then having. She did not want him. Her refusal was the most proportionate thing in the world. She was the goddess of right distribution. Of course she refused. What would it mean for the principle of balance to submit to a taking? What would it mean for the keeper of the scales to be placed on one of them? She ran. The oldest gods could transform. This is recorded consistently enough across the sources that I trusted as an element of genuine, ancient belief rather than poetic decoration. The idea that beings not yet fully crystallized into a fixed form can still shift at the boundaries of themselves. She became a fish and entered the sea. He followed, became something that could follow. She became a bird. He became the eagle, and she felt the shadow of his wingspan fall across her from above. That specific shadow, the shadow that meant he was gaining. The myth exists in fragments across several centuries and several tellers, and each version is slightly different, each one feeling its way toward what it actually means to run from something that has more power than you and has decided to use it. She became a goose. He became a swan. I need to pause here because what comes next is the part I find hardest to write about cleanly, and I want to be accurate about what the ancient sources do and don't say. They are careful in the specific way that ancient sources are careful about violations committed by powerful beings, which is to say the care doesn't look like care exactly. It looks like language, the language of transformation, the language of inevitability. The story is told in a register that makes the things seem almost natural, almost fated, almost as though it simply happened the way weather happens. But underneath that language, if you listen past it, you can hear the older frequency, the one that was there before the language was applied to it. You can feel the weight of what actually occurred. She did not choose this. That is what I am saying, as plainly as I can say it. From that union, and I am using the word the sources use, knowing it is the wrong word, knowing it is doing the work the ancient world asked it to do, which is to smooth over something that should not be smoothed. An egg was laid, enormous, gleaming, impossible. Left somewhere, the sources disagree on where exactly. Some say a forest, some say a shepherd found it, some say it was simply where it was meant to be found, as though the universe had placed it deliberately, as though even this was part of the return. From the egg came Helen of Troy. Anyway, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the woman whose beauty was the stated cause, the surface of the cause, the convenient mythology of the cause, of the greatest war the ancient world had ever assembled. 10 years on the beaches of Troy, a city burned, thousands dead on both sides of the Aegean, widows, orphans, men scattered across the sea, wandering for years, trying to find their way back to lives the war had already unmade. Odysseus spent a decade just trying to get home. Helen was the daughter of Nemesis, born of the moment when the most powerful being in existence looked at the principle of proportion and decided it did not apply to him. The consequence was a generation away. This is the part I keep returning to, the part I find. I'm not sure why this specific detail lodges in me the way it does, but it does, and I kept it. The reckoning did not fall immediately. It traveled. It grew in transit, like a wave that begins small and builds as it moves across open water, gathering everything into itself. And by the time it arrives at the shore, it is nothing like the thing that started it. The excess of one divine moment propagated outward through time and eventually broke on Troy, on the beaches, on the burning city, on people who had no direct relationship to the original act and could not have understood, standing in the fire, what chain of events had led the world to this moment. Nemesis does not always look like justice. Sometimes she looks like weather, like catastrophe, like the world simply going wrong for an extended period of time. You have to stand very far back, farther than one human life, farther than one generation, to see the shape of the return. The Trojan War was a return, a 10-year burning return. She watched, no pleasure, no grim satisfaction. The steady, impersonal attention of a principle doing what it does, the ledger being settled in the only currency available, which happened to be 10 years and 10,000 lives and a city. The scales, level. She moved on. There was always a next one. The wheel was always turning. She did not finish because she could not finish. The world kept producing excess the way it always had, the way it always would, and she kept moving toward it, slow and inevitable, and completely without anger, which is the thing about her that I find most difficult to hold in my mind even now, even having spent all this time with her. The anger would be easier. The anger would make sense. This makes a different kind of sense, older, colder. The wheel turns. It was turning before we arrived. It will turn after. She is still watching. Let us slow down now. We have been moving fast, through myths, through names, through the large and dramatic architecture of the ancient world. And there is a smaller, quieter, more interior version of all of this that needs its own space. The version that lives not in the palaces of kings or the beds of gods, but inside the ordinary human chest. The version of Nemesis that requires no goddess. The version already present in you that was there before you heard any of this, that will remain after it ends. Think about the last time you watched someone fail. Someone you knew. Not a stranger. Someone close. Maybe someone you loved. Maybe someone who had accumulated more than you across the preceding years. More luck, more money, more beauty, more attention, more of whatever the specific currency was that mattered most to you in that period of your life. And you watched them fail. And there was something in you, not the surface layer, Not the part that spoke out loud and said the appropriate things, but the layer beneath that one. The honest layer, the animal layer. Something in that layer felt, for just a moment, something you were not proud of. Something like relief. The breath that comes when a weight you did not know you were carrying is suddenly gone. You did not want them to suffer. That is true, and it is also not the whole truth. Some part of you, the part that had been keeping its own ledger, watching its own scales tipped for years under the quiet accumulation of small unfairnesses, that part felt the correction happen and called it, wordlessly, right. Some deep, inarticulate function in you recognized the return of proportion and responded to it the way lungs respond to air after being held too long underwater. That feeling is very old. That feeling is the echo of Nemesis living inside the human body. She is not only out there in the myths, in the divine machinery, in the Bronze Age palaces with their columns and their certainties. She is in here. She is the part of you that cannot abide imbalance. Not because imbalance makes you angry, exactly, but because it hurts. Because something in you is tuned to the frequency of proportion, to the specific hum of a world operating at its correct tension. And when that frequency is disturbed, you feel it in your chest as a kind of wrongness, a low, persistent ache, the feeling of something being off that you cannot name clearly enough to address. That is her, that wordless, animal sense that the scales should be level, that no single being should hold too much, that the excess of one is the deficit of another, always, without exception, regardless of how convincing the story the person with the excess tells about why they deserve it. She lived in the human body before she ever had a name. And here is the cost of carrying her, which the mythology tends to understate. The sensitivity that lets you feel the wrongness of imbalance. That same sensitivity turns on you. The part that watches the scales, watches yours. The part that measures will measure you. The part that knows, in the wordless animal layer, when someone has taken more than their portion. That same part will know when you do it, and it will not let you rest, because it is accurate, because it simply does what it does, which is to see what is true, and it is not selective about whose truth it sees. This is what I find hardest to say clearly, actually. I keep circling it from different angles and landing in roughly the same place, which is that Nemesis is not only a force that arrives from outside. She's already present in the ones she visits, already living in the king on his high golden chair, in the small, uncomfortable knowledge that won't quite leave him alone in the dark hours, in the 3 a.m. moments when the certainty cracks and something true comes through the gap. She is the knowledge that persists beneath every justification, every reassuring story, every careful self-construction. She is the thing you already know. She tells you nothing new. She makes it impossible to keep ignoring. Let me collect the thread here, because what comes next requires a slightly different framework, and I want to make sure I am bringing it in cleanly. The ancient Greeks understood hubris and nemesis as a single unit, a cycle, a continuous shape that repeats across time, the way a wave shape repeats across water, each instance distinct, but all of them the same form. The simplification, offense, then punishment, loses the thing that makes it actually true. It is one motion, inhale and exhale, the tide going and the tide returning. Two ends of the same thing. Hubris is not simply arrogance. The word has worn down from overuse and now means, roughly, excessive pride, which is close but misses the specific technical meaning the Greeks carried. In its real ancient sense, hubris is an act, a deliberate one, the deliberate humiliation of someone with less power than you. The pleasure taken in making another person feel small, going the extra step, the unnecessary step, the step that serves no practical function except to demonstrate that you exist above the ordinary moral rules, that your position removes you from the universe in which other people are required to behave. It is the display of impunity, the performance of being beyond consequence. Agamemnon, walking into the captured city of Troy, having won his war, having taken what he came for, and spreading purple cloth on the ground for his feet. Purple, the most expensive, most sacred color in the ancient world, reserved for gods, for offerings, for the most serious moments of religious contact between the human and the divine, spread on the ground for his feet to walk on. The ground was not wet, the ground was not cold. He did it because he could, because he wanted every watching eye to understand that there was nothing left in the world that he was required to treat as sacred, that the sacred itself was his to use as a floor. His wife Clytemnestra was watching from the steps. I want to stay with her for a moment longer than I probably should in a section that is supposed to move. But I keep coming back to Clytemnestra, and I think it is because she is the most human face Nemesis ever wears in the Greek material, and I find that more disturbing than the wings and the wheel and the whip, which are at least safely mythological. She was a woman. She had been given a daughter, an actual daughter, Iphigenia, and her husband had placed that daughter on an altar and killed her because a war needed favorable winds. He had done this. He had then spent 10 years at Troy doing what he was doing, and she had spent those 10 years holding that knowledge in her body, running the household, waiting, keeping the account the way the goddess keeps hers, except with blood and grief and the specific fury of someone who has had no formal mechanism available to them for redress. She killed him in his bath. I'm going to say that plainly and move on because the ornamentation would make it feel more dramatic than it actually was. And what it actually was is more disturbing than dramatic. She killed him. She had been waiting a decade. The blade was ready. The water was ready. Agamemnon walked in wearing the absolute unwatchfulness of a man who has never genuinely had to watch his back, who had spent so long operating above consequence that consequence had simply ceased to feel real to him. This is how it works in the world when the winged goddess is elsewhere. When there is no divine mechanism descending, no celestial correction of the obvious and theatrical kind, Nemesis finds a vessel. She concentrates in a person or a situation or a decade of accumulated pressure until the pressure finds its release. And the release, when it comes, it does not look elegant. It looks like a woman killing her husband in his bath. It looks like a war ending in ash. It looks like the thing you are celebrating is already over by the time you realize the celebration was premature. His purple cloth became his burial cloth. His excess became his ending. The return arrived precisely in the exact shape of the original act. Anyway, Polycrates of Samos, a tyrant in the old Greek sense, which means a ruler who holds power by force rather than inheritance, and carries no automatic moral judgment, only a description of the mechanism. He was famous, famously, impossibly, suspiciously fortunate. His fleet dominated the Aegean. His treasury was full. His city was well built. Every war he entered, he won. Every storm his ships encountered, they survived. Every enemy defeated. Every year, good. The kind of sustained, unbroken fortune that stops feeling like luck and starts feeling like a structural feature of the universe, like the universe has simply decided this man succeeds and arranged itself accordingly. Nemesis, the pharaoh of Egypt, was his ally, his friend, and Nemesis wrote him a letter. I want to pause on this letter because I find there is something in this letter that gets me in a way I can't fully account for, and I have kept it in every version of this I have written, which is probably reason enough to mention it. The letter said, "I am worried about your luck. I have never seen fortune this good, concentrated in one man, without it eventually correcting itself in a way that cost that man everything. The gods are uncomfortable with this level of accumulation. The scales are being watched. Before the correction comes from outside, in a form you didn't choose and cannot control. Choose it yourself. Take the thing you value most. Throw it into the sea. Create the loss before loss is made for you." The letter is remarkable because it is, functionally, a man writing to his friend to explain how Nemesis works. No mythological framing. No goddess invoked by name. Just a pharaoh writing to king saying, "I know how this ends. I have seen how this ends. Please do something about it before it ends that way for you." It reads, "I almost reached for a comparison that would have pulled us 3 millennia forward in a way that doesn't quite fit. Never mind." Polycrates read the letter. He considered it. He took his most prized possession, a ring, an emerald ring set in gold, the thing he valued above all other things. He rowed out to sea. He threw it in. He went home. He felt, presumably, the particular flat sensation of a loss that has not yet arrived, the grief of anticipating the grief. 3 days later, a fisherman brought a fish to the palace kitchens. A large fish, a gift for the king. The cook opened the fish. Inside the fish was the ring. The sea had sent it back. Polycrates showed the ring to his court, wrote back to Nemesis. Nemesis read the letter and dissolved the alliance, withdrew, sent word that he would no longer be responsible for watching what was coming, because what was coming for a man whose sacrificial ring was returned by the sea was beyond the reach of ordinary friendship to prevent. He was right. Polycrates was dead within a decade. The exact mechanism of the death is, honestly, a bit grim, and I am going to summarize it without the details. He was lured to a meeting, captured, executed, left on a hillside. The fortune that had been so complete and so sustained ended with a totality that felt, to the ancient Greeks who recorded it, like it had been calibrated. Like the duration and the weight of his luck required an ending of equivalent size. The ring came back from the sea. The ledger was already closed. The wheel turns. She was watching. She is always watching. The scales tip. They always return. Not because she forces them, because that is what scales do when the weight is real and the arm is true and time is long enough. The pattern holds. It always held. It holds now. He had a ring, an emerald set in gold, made by the finest craftsman on the island, worn for years on the same finger through everything that had happened to him, through the victories, through the storms his ship survived, through the accumulated decades of impossible luck. He loved it the way you love objects that have been present at enough of your life that they start to feel like witnesses. He rowed out to sea. He threw it in. He felt, in the moment after his hand opened, that he had done something real, that the offering had been made, that the reckoning had been met and could now leave him alone. A week later, a fisherman brought him a fish. Large, impressive, a gift for a tyrant's table. The cook opened it. Inside the stomach of the fish, still gleaming, still gold, was the ring. The sea had sent it back. The sacrifice was refused. The world had looked at the offering and decided it was insufficient and returned it without explanation, which is the most unsettling kind of refusal, the kind with no reasoning attached, no counteroffer, no indication of what would actually be enough. Polycrates held the ring and understood, in some part of himself, that the pattern he had been trying to interrupt was still running, that the account was still open, that the reckoning was still accumulating and would accumulate until the moment it chose, which would not be a moment he selected. He was lured to the mainland later by a Persian satrap. Promises of treasure, promises of alliance, the kind of arrangement that sounds almost too good. And Polycrates, who had spent decades living inside an existence that was almost too good, had lost the ability to feel the distinction. He went, he was killed. Crucified on a hill in the Persian fashion, his body left exposed, the birds making their slow work of everything that had been Polycrates of Samos, everything that had been the outward and dazzling structure of his fortune. The ring, presumably, with him, returned by the sea, kept, part of the story to the end. I think about this detail more than I probably should. There is something in the returned ring that I keep circling back to, that I find. I'm not entirely sure what I find in it. Something about the world's refusal to be appeased on a schedule that isn't its own. Something about the difference between a genuine reckoning and a performed one. I kept it because it seems important, and I am still working out exactly why. You cannot pay in advance for a debt that hasn't been calculated yet. Polycrates tried to make a preemptive gesture to throw something valuable into the machinery before the machinery demanded it, and the machinery looked at what he threw and handed it back and went on calculating. The account was still open. The return had not yet arrived. The ring was not the thing the world needed from him, until one day it didn't need anything from him anymore, because there was nothing left to need it from. This is the system. This is the mechanism. In the mythology and in the world, excess accumulates, the measuring continues, the return arrives, the scales find their level. Not always on your schedule, not always in the form you expected, not always in a shape you recognize as connected to the original act, but always. The great debt always finds its creditor. The great river, as someone said. Well, I had a different ending in mind for that sentence, and I lost it. The point stands. She is always watching. Now the story reaches the place where the warmth comes out of it. I want to prepare you for this, which is something I almost never do. But this part of the material changes texture in a way that I think is worth acknowledging before we're already inside it. We have been talking about kings, about tyrants, about the grand and dramatic cases, the men with crowns and armies and golden rings, the women who waited a decade with a blade, the beautiful boys at the edge of pools. The scale of those stories provides a kind of insulation. The subjects are enormous and literary, and surrounded by centuries of philosophical commentary. You can feel the weight of them without the weight landing directly on your chest, because the distance is structural. Kings are not people you know. Troy is not your street. But she does not only come for kings. She keeps all the ledgers, the small ones too, the very small ones, the ones that belong not to dynasties, but to households, not to empires, but to the specific, fragile, daily negotiations of being in a relationship with another person, the ledger of a friendship, a marriage, a family that stopped speaking by degrees so gradual that no single moment of stopping is visible when you look back. Just a slow cooling, like a room where someone forgot to tend the fire. She was in those rooms too. She was in the texture of the silences that accumulated in those rooms. She was in the moment when one person took more than their portion of the space between two people. More of the quiet, more of the grace, more of the assumption that the other person would absorb the cost of the imbalance. And the other person felt it and said nothing, said nothing again, said nothing for long enough that saying something became a different kind of impossible. Not because the words were unavailable, but because the gap had grown so wide that a word thrown across it would simply fall in and vanish. Let me collect the thread here, because this is the section I find hardest to move through quickly, and I am going to resist the temptation to rush it. The domestic ledger, the private one, the ledger of small takings, which individually seem harmless, which are each, in isolation, defensible. A little more space assumed here, a little more grace taken there, a need ignored once, a sacrifice made invisible once, a request denied so many times that the person making it quietly retired it, folded it up, put it somewhere deep, stopped asking, each entry small, the accumulation enormous, the structure, after years of these entries, so tilted from its original level that it cannot hold and hasn't been able to hold for a long time. The only remaining question is which direction it will fall and who will be under it when it does. And when it falls, the person who carried the lighter side will say, "Where did this come from? This feels sudden. This feels disproportionate to the specific thing I did." Because they were not keeping the ledger. They didn't have to. They were on the right side of it. This is the face of Nemesis that the mythology doesn't really show you, because mythology is drawn to the dramatic and the domestic is. I almost reach for a word from a much more recent conversation about these dynamics, a word that would have yanked us entirely out of the ancient framework. I pulled back. The point is that this face exists, and most of us will see this face rather than the other ones. Most of us will encounter her not on a burning pyre or bent over a pool, but in the ordinary wreckage of something that mattered and was not tended. Anyway, we have all been Narcissus, the version without the fatal pool, the smaller version where we were so full of our own reflection that the person across from us slowly ran out of reasons to stay in the room, and we noticed they were gone before we noticed we had been the reason they left. We have all been creasers, the version without the rivers of gold, the smaller version where we built something and became certain of it, and forgot that certainty is itself a kind of reaching, a kind of claiming permanence that was never ours to claim, and something came to remind us. We have all been polycrates in the worst way, I think. The version where we threw the ring in and waited to feel clean and didn't, because the gesture was hollow at its center, because what the world required was not a symbol of sacrifice, but the actual thing, whatever the actual thing was, and we had offered the symbol, hoping it would do. She does not come from outside your life. She is assembled from inside it, from the accumulated weight of everything you did not examine, everything taken past the point when it should have been returned. She is already here. She has been here. And this is what I find hardest to hold, even now, even after spending all this time inside this material. She did not arrive at the moment of crisis. That moment is just when you finally looked up and saw her. She had been arriving for years, the same slow, inevitable movement, the same unhurried approach of the tide. Your body knew, even in the first small moment of the first small excess, your body registered something, a faint dissonance, like a note played wrong in a piece of music you have heard enough times to know in your sleep. You don't stop. The music keeps going. The next note covers it, and the next, and the next, until there are enough wrong notes that the piece you thought you were playing has become something else entirely, something you would not have recognized at the beginning, something no one would call music. Your body knew that dissonance, that was her. The winged dark figure of the myths is the dramatic version. The version your body carries is quieter and has no wings and does not announce itself. It just knows. It knows proportion the way the ear knows pitch, not as a concept held in the mind, not as a rule you learned, but as a sensation, a felt thing, immediate and physical and prior to language. That part of you always knows. It knew then. The question that remains, the one the mythology circles without quite landing on, whether we listen. The climax of her story is not a sword or a fire or a wave breaking. It is the moment of recognition. The king on the pyre saying the philosopher's name. Narcissus finally understanding at the edge of the water that the face in the pool has always been incapable of reaching back for him. Polycrates opening the fish and finding the gold winking up from the dark of its stomach. Agamemnon stepping onto purple cloth, while behind him, on the steps, his wife watches with 10 years of patience finally running out. The recognition, the moment the scales become visible to the person standing on them. That moment is her. That is what she is. Everything else, the wings, the wheel, the dark origins, the mythology, the theology, all of it is just the ancient world's attempt to give a shape to something that lives inside the structure of things, that is older than any shape they could give it. The recognition is what she was always moving toward. The return to knowing what you already knew. She was always going to get there. She always does. The climax of her story is the seeing, the moment when the thing that was always true becomes impossible to keep pretending is not true. The moment the ledger is placed in front of you and you recognize your own handwriting in every entry. You cannot schedule this moment. You cannot engineer an escape from it by being careful enough, examined enough, sufficiently self-aware, though self-awareness helps. holding the ledger up to the light yourself before it is handed to you is always better than having it handed to you without warning. But you cannot avoid the ledger entirely because you are a living thing with needs and with desire. And desire always reaches, always takes, always wants a little more than the allotted portion. This is the condition of being alive and wanting. The question is only whether you look at the wanting honestly, whether you hold the ledger up occasionally and ask, is the excess building? Is the return accumulating somewhere I cannot yet see? If you can do that, if you can look at it without flinching away, then you are doing the work she was sent to do. You are balancing the scales yourself in the quiet before the reckoning arrives. You are practicing Nemesis on yourself. And if you can be the keeper of your own ledger, the measurer of your own accumulation, the one who notices the tipping before the world has to notice it for you, then the winged figure in the dark stays where she is, because there is nothing left for her to do. If this story is landing somewhere in you, if the weight of it is real in the chest, there is a place to carry it with others. People who come to these stories, to these old truths, to sit in the dark together and remember what the world used to know about itself. Come find us. The door is always open. She won. Every time, in every version, by every available measure. The scales returned to level. The excess came back. The accounts were settled. The proud were brought low, and the taken was given back, and the ledger, however long it had been running, however complex its entries, closed, balanced, and yet sit with the hollow at the center of that winning, because it is there. You can feel it if you look directly at the endings rather than away from them. Narcissus dissolved into flowers, Croesus on the pyre, Polycrates on the hill outside a Persian city, Agamemnon in the water, Troy burning against the sky that had been watching for 10 years and would watch for 10 more, while the survivors scattered across the sea, trying to find their way back to lives the war had already fundamentally changed. Sit with what is at the center of every corrected scale. The correction does not restore what was lost. This is the thing the mythology of Nemesis cannot resolve, and I want to be precise about it because I think it is the most important thing, and I have been circling it this whole time without quite saying it directly. When the scales return to level, they return to level in a present that has been irrevocably shaped by the period of imbalance. Echo is still a voice in the hills. The pool where Narcissus dissolved still holds in its still surface the perfect unreachable reflection of a face that is no longer there. The merchants who lost their ships while Polycrates' fleet ruled the Aegean, their ships are still lost. The men who died at Troy are still dead. The children born in the years of drought, in the long shadow of another man's accumulated fortune, they still live those years, in their bodies and their futures, and the children they would eventually have, and those children's lives. The reckoning does not undo, it does not restore, it does not resurrect. Let me collect the thread here, because this is the section I keep wanting to rush through, and I think that impulse is wrong. The hollow at the center of every corrected scale. The grief of a justice that arrives into a world already changed by injustice and leaves it changed in a different way, and the world that exists after the correction is balanced, but it is arranged differently than it was before the excess began, and some of what was rearranged cannot be rearranged back. I am not sure I have ever found exactly the right way to hold this idea, and I have tried several times in several different drafts of this section, and I am trying again now. The world after correction carries the marks of both the excess and the return in its landscape. It is level. It is the same total weight, but the distribution has shifted, and not everything that shifted can shift back. Croesus, advising Cyrus in his diminished wisdom, is balanced. He is where the world needs him, but he is not who he was. The treasury is gone. The living architecture of his life, the particular irreplaceable structure of being Croesus at the height of his certainty, gone. The wisdom he carries was paid for with everything that made him Croesus. The lesson came. The tuition was his world. Think about what that actually means in the texture of daily life. The morning, some weeks after the pyre, when Croesus woke in the palace of Cyrus, guest, advisor, a man valued for what he'd learned rather than what he'd held, and reached, in the first unfocused moment of consciousness, for something that was no longer there. The specific shape of the absence, the particular weight of it in the hands, the weight of having had and now not having, which is different from never having had, and is a kind of grief the language of loss doesn't fully cover. You learn to move around an absence the way you move around furniture that has been taken out of a room. You reach for it before you remember. You find the empty air. You remember. This is what the hollow victory actually costs, day after day after day. Anyway, she knew this. The goddess, the principle, whatever she is, she carried the knowledge that correction is not restoration, that justice arrives into a world already changed by injustice and leaves it changed again in a different direction, and the changing does not cancel. She did not stop. The mechanism has no setting for stopping. But if you listen to the silence after the scales return to level, in the mythology, in the long echoing aftermath of every settled account, there is something that sounds like grief. The grief of a universe that had to correct itself, had to spend the tremendous, irreversible cost of a reckoning to return to a state that should never have been abandoned, had to use its own deepest mechanism to restore what should never have required restoring. The world grieves its corrections. I believe that. I kept this idea through several versions of this section where it felt too much, where I almost cut it. I kept it because I think it is true, and the fact that it is difficult to justify rigorously doesn't change that. And we grieve too in our bodies, in the specific hollow we feel after a long imbalance is finally set right. The relief is real. The return of proportion is felt in the body as a genuine release, a breath taken after a very long time of not quite breathing. But underneath the relief, the grief, the recognition of what the imbalance cost, of what the correction cost, of the years between the first tipping and the final return to center, and what lived in those years and what did not. The grief sits under the relief like a floor under a room. You don't always notice it, but it is what you are standing on. The universal mirror. Nemesis holds up. I keep reaching for this image and slightly missing it, like trying to describe a color that sits between two colors you have words for. The mirror she holds is this. We are all, always, somewhere in the middle of a ledger, all of us carrying some surplus that belongs elsewhere. all of us, simultaneously, on the deficit side of other scales, owed something that has not been returned, aching for a portion of our rightful allocation that is currently sitting on someone else's side, in someone else's life, in forms we don't always recognize as what we're missing. We are all the measurer and the measured, the excess and the deficit and the correction, all at once, in different areas, in different relationships, in different private ledgers we keep without knowing we're keeping them. Something about the idea of everyone simultaneously holding too much in one place and too little in another feels. I almost reached for a word that belongs to a much more recent vocabulary about systems and networks and interconnection. I let it go. The ancient world had its own language for this, and it is sufficient. We are all Nemesis, measuring. We are all the one being measured. The question, the real question, the one that opens in the chest when you have sat with this long enough, is whether the correction will come from outside or from you. Whether you will look at your own ledger in the honest quiet of a night like this one and see where you are carrying weight that belongs elsewhere, where you have taken past the point of return, where you have been full at someone else's expense, and whether you will begin quietly, without performance, without the drama of a grand gesture thrown into the sea, to return what you are holding before she has to. The tempo slows here. It has to. This part takes time. It is daily. It is not dramatic, and it carries no mythology, and it has no shape that resolves cleanly. It is just a life. The small, continuous, mostly invisible work of trying to stay proportionate, of trying to want only what is yours, of trying to see the other side of the scale with something close to the clarity you bring to your own side. That is the work. Nemesis, in her most important form, is not the winged figure descending on the proud. She is the still, impersonal, patient attention of the world, watching everything and remembering everything and tracking everything. She is an accounting system that never closes, never loses an entry. She's paying attention. The only question left, the only one that matters after all of this, whether you will too. Let the breath slow down. Just let it. Let the story find the places in the body where it was always going to land, the places behind thinking, underneath it, the layer where old things sit and get recognized without you having words for them, without you needing words for them. There is a question living inside the mythology of Nemesis, and it has no answer. It has been living there for 2,500 years. It will keep living there when this voice stops and the dark comes back. It doesn't want resolution. It isn't asking to be solved. It wants to be held, sat with, acknowledged as the real thing underneath all the other things. The question the myths circled without ever quite landing on directly. The question is this: if the world is built so that excess must return, if proportion is the deep law, the actual law, the one even Zeus couldn't finally get around, then what do we do with the wanting? Not the taking, not the excess itself, the desire, the feeling, the ache that has existed in every living thing that has ever looked at what it has and felt, in the wordless, animal honesty of pure sensation that it is not enough, the reaching that isn't a decision, the wanting that was there before you were old enough to be responsible for it. That will be there as long as you're alive, because it is part of what alive means. I'm going to try to say this carefully because it's easy to get wrong. We are built to want more. That is not a flaw. It is the engine of everything, of creativity, of love, of discovery, of every beautiful thing humans have ever made or reached for or stumbled toward in the dark. The wanting is the force that moves. Without it, nothing moves. Without the desire for more connection, more meaning, more understanding of what any of this is, the whole architecture of human achievement goes still, goes proportionate, goes perfectly, silently, finally still. But the reaching is what creates the imbalance. The wanting is what tips the scales. Nemesis is the response to the wanting. So we are built to want, and the universe is built to correct the wanting. And between those two facts, there is a gap, a tension, a space that has never been resolved and possibly cannot be resolved. That is simply the condition of being a living, wanting, reaching thing in a universe that prefers proportion. I don't know how else to say it. I've been sitting with this particular formulation for longer than I should admit, and I'm not sure I've found a better one. How do you hold both? How do you want fully without taking past your portion? How do you reach without grasping? How do you love without consuming? How do you live with all the force and hunger that living requires inside the constraints of the scales? I don't have the answer. The Greeks didn't either. Zeus wanted Nemesis, and the wanting itself violated the principles she embodied. And even the king of the gods couldn't hold the tension, couldn't want and also honor the wanting of the one he wanted, couldn't reach without grasping. The oldest figures in the mythology couldn't answer this. I don't think we'll answer it tonight. Let me collect the thread. I think the asking of it, the real, honest, sitting with it, asking of it, is itself a kind of practice, a kind of nemesis applied from the inside, a kind of keeping the ledger in real time by asking regularly in the silence of nights like this one. Am I reaching or grasping? Am I wanting or taking? Am I full at someone else's expense? Is the scale level? Is the scale level? She whispers it sometimes, in the space just before sleep, not with words, with the feeling, that old wordless animal sensation of something being not quite right, a note played wrong, a weight on one side that doesn't belong there, the feeling that wakes you at 3 a.m. for no reason you can name, but for a reason that, if you were honest, you could name. Listen for it, not with fear, with the kind of respect you give to something very old, something that has been watching longer than you have been alive, something that keeps better records than you do and holds them without anger, without judgment, without anything except the steady, patient attention of a principle that simply does what it does. She is not here to hurt you. She is here to return you to yourself, to the version of you that is exactly the right size, that takes exactly what is yours, that holds the scale level, not because it is forced to, but because it has learned in the deepest layer of itself that the level scale is the only way to be fully, genuinely, sustainably at rest. The Greeks had a word for that, eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, which I've always found that translation slightly thin. Like the word happiness just doesn't have the weight for what they meant. It means the good flourishing of your inner spirit, the particular kind of well-being that comes not from having more, but from being exactly what you are, in proportion, in balance, with your portion taken and your portion given, and the scales between you and the world held level by the steady, daily, unspectacular practice of proportion. Anyway, this is what she is protecting, not just the rights of the ones who are depleted by another's excess, not just the abstract principle of fairness as a concept, the possibility of eudaimonia, the possibility of the kind of peace that is only available to a being who is living in proportion, who is not carrying too much, who is not owed too much, who stands in the middle of the scale with both sides balanced and feels, in the body, the particular quality of that, the stillness of it, the groundedness, the absence of the low-grade dread that lives in excess, the absence of the ache that lives in deficit, the simple, deeply human experience of being enough and habits enough and being in right relationship with the world. She is protecting this for you, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when the return is costly, when the ledger settles at a price you didn't know you were paying. Even then, she is protecting the possibility of this, clearing the way, restoring the condition, the goddess in the dark with the wings and the scales and the perfect patient attention. She is not your enemy. She is the world's memory of what you are supposed to be. Settle into that. Let it hold you. Come back now to the beginning. Come back to the air over the Aegean before the Aegean had a name. The salt and the iron and the olive wood burning at the edge of the cliff. Come back to the thing that, I'm going to try to say this plainly and hope it lands, the thing most people miss. That Nemesis was not what they think she was. Not revenge, not punishment. Not the simple satisfaction of watching the proud stumble. Something older than that, stranger, more necessary and, in the end, more tender than any of that. She was the world's love of proportion. She was the universe's refusal to let its own deep structure be permanently distorted by the wanting of any one being, however powerful, however beautiful, however certain of their own exceptionalism. She was the tide that always returns, the river that always finds the sea, the breath out that always follows the breath in. She was not separate from the world. She was one of the world's ways of being itself. And you have always known this, before tonight, before this voice in the dark, before any story got told. You were already carrying this knowledge in the wordless layer, in the animal body, in the part of you that feels the wrongness of imbalance as a physical sensation and the rightness of proportion as a kind of rest. You knew it the first time you watched something tip too far and felt the pull in your chest towards center. You knew it the first time you recognized in yourself the taking of more than your portion and felt the small, uncomfortable, honest truth of it. You knew it. Nemesis is not a goddess you need to be introduced to. She is a goddess you need to be reminded of. The reminder is not a warning, not a threat, not a command to want less or constrain yourself into the shape of someone who never reaches for anything. The reminder is this: the scale is always being kept. The ledger is always open. The measurements are always being taken. And if you participate in the keeping, if you add your own honest attention to the attention that is already on you, the reckoning, when it comes, will be gentle, will be the small corrections of a person who is paying attention, rather than the great disorienting correction of a person who has not looked at their ledger in years. The scale wants to be level, It will find its level, with or without you. But it is so much better, so much more like eudaimonia, so much more like the particular and irreplaceable piece of being in proportion, to be the one who keeps it level yourself, to be the one who does the small daily work of return and acknowledgement and proportion, who does not wait for the wave to arrive, but watches the tide with clear eyes and honest heart and steps back voluntarily from the line of excess before the sea takes you back itself. You can do this, not perfectly, not always, not without the wanting, without the reaching, without the specific luminous, fully human ache of desire, but with enough awareness to see the scale, to check it, to return what has been borrowed, to give back what was taken, to let the love move outward instead of pooling inward, to be the small correction, the daily unspectacular practice of proportion that makes the dramatic reckoning unnecessary, the idea of everyone simultaneously holding too much in one place and too little in another feels. I almost reached for a word that belongs to a much more recent vocabulary, a vocabulary about systems and networks and interconnection. I let it go. The ancient world had its own language for this, and it is sufficient. We are all Nemesis, measuring. We are all the one being measured. The question, the real question, the one that opens in the chest when you've sat with this long enough, is whether the correction will come from outside or from you, whether you will look at your own ledger in the honest quiet of a night like this one and see where you are carrying weight that belongs elsewhere, where you have taken past the point of return, where you have been full at someone else's expense, and whether you will begin quietly, without performance, without the drama of a grand gesture thrown into the sea, to return what you are holding, before she has to. The tempo slows here. It has to. This part takes time. It is daily. It is not dramatic. It has no shape that resolves cleanly. It is just a life. The small, continuous, mostly invisible work of trying to stay proportionate, of trying to want only what is yours, of trying to see the other side of the scale with something close to the clarity you bring to your own side. That is the work. Nemesis, in her most important form, is not the winged figure descending on the proud. She is the still, impersonal, patient attention of the world, watching everything and remembering everything and tracking everything. An accounting system that never closes, never loses an entry. She is paying attention. The only question left, whether you will too. Let the ancient air go. Let the Aegean return to the map. Let the goddess fold her dark wings and settle back into wherever she came from, the deep dark of the oldest night, where she is always resting, always watching, always ready, endlessly patient, endlessly attentive, waiting for the ledger that will call her out again. She is always there. She is always there. If this story carried you somewhere, if the wings in the dark and the ancient ledger and the question without an answer opened something in you that you want to keep open, then the next episode is for you. It tells the story of Ananke, the goddess of necessity, the one who exists before even fate, before even destiny, before even the decision of what is possible, the one the fates answer to, the one whose name means constraint, compulsion, inevitability. And I want to be careful here, because those words sound like they belong in a legal document. And what I mean is something much older and stranger than that. Something that has something that sits underneath all the other structures, like bedrock sits underneath soil, like the thing the soil rests on, without knowing it. Ananke holds the spindle. Nemesis holds the scales. Ananke holds the spindle. The ledger versus the thread. I'm not going to explain the difference tonight. The next episode will do that better than I can right now, at this hour, in this condition. All you have to do is return. The story will be here. Good night.